So I switched to English, and hello and good morning to everyone here in the room and online. I think we had a very exciting day yesterday, preparing for today, having some political debates on about the more general question of capitalism and the renewal of the German model. And as I said yesterday, our objective of this current workshop has very much been to present a couple of studies on how to define or how to apply new economic thinking and a new economic model to the German situation, so that we had a couple of studies that have been worked through and have been done in the last year on very important main subjects, so that we now have a couple of studies to present, and we said, well, then we can present these studies in one day or some more than one day. But essentially, we will present these studies today. We have touched a lot of these topics yesterday, like inequality, like the German export model, very exciting yesterday, some numbers on the threat to the German export model currently. We have been talking about industrial policy already, with some ideas on how to cope with transition, with structural breaks. And we have been talking about fiscal policy already, the debt break and the question of investment. And all these questions are the topics in the core of our studies that we will present today. Essentially, and then we have some highlights, supplementary highlights, also talking about the German model, and I'm very confident that this will be very exciting. We will have Thomas Piketty, who will join us via Zoom in a little more than an hour. We will have a very excellent podium where the people on the podium already started to battle behind the scenes in their preparation on the German economists, and we will have some German, some English, some French economists, and this promised to be very exciting in the afternoon. Before, at the end of the afternoon, we will have another highlight with the talk between Joe Stiglitz and Olaf Scholz. As you know, Joe Stiglitz has been one of the most harsh critiques of German fiscal policy in the last decades, let's say, especially during the Euro crisis and afterwards. Now, maybe Germany has changed, apparently, his approach to fiscal policy, at least in this Corona crisis. And the big question will be, is this enough? Is this right? What will happen next? Will we need to go back to austerity? And if yes, at what time? So that will be a highly exciting debate also. I just wanted to recall one chart that we presented yesterday from the survey that we commissioned from Forsa on Germans' attitude towards the social economy, capitalism, and so on. And one of the striking results has been that the promise of the social justice, which is implied in the social market economy, the big German model, 50% of people say this principle is not satisfied anymore. So that's something which goes through a lot of data that we have collected, and the poll has had some other results which go in the same direction. And this all shows that apparently one of the main topics that we will have to cope with is this inequality, this sort of feeling that people very apparently have, that things are not going right because some people gain much more than others, and it's for some people much more difficult to get at the same rhythm. And also one of the big topics in this sense is the loss of control that people seem to feel in their personal development and careers. So these topics are really at the core, and we're very happy to have this topic today on the agenda, just in the, right in the morning. And I will hand over to Marc, my colleague, our economic analyst, who will lead the session and say some words on this project, why we have focused and what we have done already, and what we will do now on inequality. Thank you. Just before you start, again, you know these rules. Please take care here in the room to keep these distances and so on. And for the people on Zoom, as yesterday, please signal if you want to have if you have a question. You can use the question and answers button, and then we will try and bring in. We're just in a new situation, this hybrid conferences, so we are trying to bring both the real people and Zoom people into the discussion. So just signal and show if whenever you have a question there. So Marc, please.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is working, yes. My name is Marc, and I'm very glad to be moderating this first panel. As you already heard from this presentation, we will have presentations of 4 studies today, and this one is one of our flagship projects. It is actually a multi-year research project. If you have been at our launch or followed us, you will have seen that we actually had already presented part 1 of this project last year in October at our launch event, and that was very exciting. Today we are very glad to have Charlotte Bartels here from the DIW. She and her team are leading this whole multi-year research project on inequality in Germany, and Charlotte today will present part 2, and I can already hint that we are preparing for actually stage 3 of the project. I don't want to tell too much about that, but please stay tuned, because it is a highly relevant topic. As you already heard, the whole idea of the Forum New Economy was to find answers about the rise of populism and so forth, and inequality is probably explains a great deal of that. I might even say we start off where Hart aber fair yesterday finished. They had already also a big discussion on inequality between East and West Germany. We're not talked too much about that, maybe a little bit. We will see from Charlotte. I don't want to take too much away from that, but we are also very glad to have 2 excellent commentators on the topic. After Charlotte's presentation, we have Chancel from the World Inequality Lab, who's working with Thomas Piketty, and we will have Andreas Peichl from the INSTITUT commenting. Clara unfortunately couldn't make it, so apologies for that. And I will also do my best to include the virtual audience. As Thomas already said, I have my laptop here, so I will try and include. So please also hello to the virtual audience out there. Feel free to write in the chat, use the Q&A function, and so forth. Okay, I think we can start. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity to present our short paper on drivers of inequality in Germany, which is joint work with my colleague at DIW, Carsten Schröder. And we prepared this report particularly for the Forum New Economy. So, as you've heard in a variety of talks and I guess in the public debate, the economic inequality in Germany has markedly increased since unification in 1990. So economic inequality, by this I mean wealth inequality and income inequality has increased. But there is a large debate still ongoing which factors actually drive these changes. In the recent debate, we've seen an increasing focus on house prices and rents, which have markedly also increased within the last decade or so. So in our short paper, we estimate the contribution of rental income to household income inequality in Germany and the net housing wealth to household net wealth inequality in Germany. So we focus on two variables from the real estate market, one being the income that is generated by housing and the other being the wealth that comes from owning house, and how this is particularly related to the inequality of income and the inequality of wealth in Germany. So in one sense, you could say that we try to provide a first answer on, is it actually mattering that much that we're talking so much about house prices and rent if we are concerned with economic inequality, and to what extent do these factors influence the economic inequality in Germany? As the location of the house is of central importance for both the house price and the rent that the house is generating or the inhabitants have to pay as rent, we also differentiate between urban and rural districts to get a first impression if actually what was also seen in the public debate, urban districts have been hit more by rising house prices and rising rents than rural areas. So just to give you a short impression on how economic inequality or income inequality has evolved in Germany, I give you just one graph from my colleagues produced at DRW, Markus Grabka and Jan Göbel, on how disposable household income has evolved across the 10 deciles of the distribution. And what I just want you to take away is that the uppermost decile, the top 10%, have seen a marked increase. Their incomes have almost grown by 20% since the early 2000s, whereas the bottom two deciles have actually seen a decrease in disposable household income. So this is income after government taxes and transfers. So the large literature on explaining inequality trends across the world and also in Germany has largely focused on labor income. So why is that? Pre-government income can be broadly defined as the sum of labor income and capital income, but the largest part of the population relies just on labor income, so only receives small capital incomes. There's also a lot of data documenting earnings across the population by administrative data providers. So there's a large literature that investigates the drivers of labor income inequality. But as we've seen, for example, by Thomas Piketty's pioneering work, capital income actually increased in importance macroeconomically over the past few decades. So as capital income, which is interest income, dividends, and rental income, is concentrated at the top of the income distribution, where the capital owners are located at. This macroeconomic increase in capital income with respect to labor income almost mechanically translates into higher income inequality. But this has not been very much addressed in the literature, in the traditional literature on income inequality. And more recently, researchers take up this aspect of income inequality that comes from capital income. So this is also something that we want to pursue in this paper. We look at rental income as a form of capital income that accrues to some part of at the top, and probably even to a larger extent than interest income or dividends. Rental income is of a significant size for the top decile, whereas interest income or dividends accrue only to the very, very top in a significant magnitude of the distribution. So what has the literature on labor income inequality found so far, investigating trends, drivers of these trends? So first of all, labor income can be defined as the product of paid working hours and hourly wage. So many studies focus on wage inequality to understand how differences in wages drive inequality trends over time. And many studies have stressed that between firm inequality is one of the main factors behind rising wage inequality in Germany. So between firm inequality means that some firms just pay higher average wages than other firms, and it greatly matters to what extent these different average wages between firms increased over time to explain overall wage inequality in Germany. The other important factor that has been highlighted by several studies, particularly for the lower half of the wage distribution, is the decline of unions and also increased education and age. So the divergence between higher educated workers and older workers and younger workers and less educated workers also plays an important role for explaining wage inequality in Germany. So now this is just on wage, the literature. Then there's some studies also. We're looking at the interplay of hours and wages to explain overall labor income inequality, for example, by my colleague Carsten Schröder and Matthias Beckmannshagen, and they find that, in fact, in the rising inequality of working hours, so a lot of women entering the labor market working only part-time, also a lot of men not working full-time these days anymore, is key for explaining increased labor income inequality. So, as the third stage of this larger project of the new forum wants to find solutions against rising inequality, these may be some factors that one could address. That between firm inequality, deunionization are of great importance for explaining labor income inequality. But now let us look at capital income inequality in the form of rental income. How has rental income and real estate wealth actually evolved in Germany over the past 15 years? How does this differ across regions, and to what extent can this explain increased income inequality if we look not only at labor income but also at capital income, so at the full pre-government income concepts? So first of all, let us look at how many households actually receive rental income in Germany and how is this distributed across federal states. And the main takeaway I want you to see is that there is large variation across federal states and a large gap between eastern federal states and western federal states. So in the east of Germany, less than 9% of households do receive rental income, whereas in West Germany, more than 10%, or for example in Baden-Württemberg, between 15 and 18% of households, so almost every fifth household receives a rental income. So they are landlords in 2017. There has been some catch up, but definitely there is still a large persistent gap. So how does this picture look if we differentiate the households into rural households living in rural areas or more consolidated or urban, highly consolidated areas? Here you see how the share of landlords has evolved across these different regions. So in rural areas, you see, for example, that there has been about 9% of landlord households in 2002 and about 12% in 2017. You see the same trend in highly consolidated and also to some extent in consolidated areas. So we conclude that there has been an increase in households who have non-owner occupied housing, so of households who own real estate that they rent out across regions in Germany, being either rural or urban. So in theory, all of these households receive more rental income, but of course this depends, how much they receive depends on how high the rent is that they can generate in the location of the house. So how has this increased share of rental income and probably also the increased the increased discrepancy in rental income contributed to income inequality in Germany. Here you can see that in 2002, rental income explained about 9% of overall income inequality in Germany, of pre-government household income inequality. And 15 years later, this share increased to 16%. So the overall importance of rental income in explaining total income inequality in Germany has significantly increased between 2002 and 2017. If we look at pre-government household income, if we now look at post-government household income, this looks even more dramatic, because post-government household income is less unequally distributed per se. So here we see that rental income in post-government household income inequality has contributed about 20% in 2002 and 30% in 2017. So the same picture, rental income contributes an increasing share to total income inequality in Germany. So now let's move on to wealth inequality, where we want to focus on real estate. So how has wealth inequality evolved in Germany since unification? I have a paper with Thilo Albers and Moritz Schulerich that shows these trends, taking all the different survey data we have in Germany into account, and also uprating them to national accounts, and also taking care of the missing wealthy at the top with the Manager Magazine Rich List. And compiling all these different data sources, we find a significant increase in the Gini coefficient, which is what you see on the left-hand uppermost panel since the 1990s. And we see, what I also want you to draw your attention at, is that the bottom half has a declining share in total wealth, but also take into account the y-axis. The bottom 5% only own 5% of total wealth in the 90s, and today this has declined to about 3%. So one can see, I guess you have already heard that, but just to highlight that again, that half of the population in Germany owns virtually nothing. Then the middle class, the middle 40%, owns about 40%, and we see quite stable evolution, and the top decile has seen an increasing share in overall wealth in Germany. So you see that in the 90s their share was about 50%, and these days their share has reached about 55%. So to what extent does real estate contribute to this trend? First of all, showing you differential growth rates again, which are partly behind the trends that I just showed you, but just to highlight again the inequality of wealth growth that we've seen in Germany over the past 3 decades. The bottom 50% has virtually seen no wealth growth. The next 40% has seen a wage growth of about 80%, and the top 1% have seen a wealth growth of 140%. So this is the differential wealth growth rates also explain the different, the increasing Gini coefficient and top wealth shares. So showing you again a map across federal state in Germany, how is the ownership of housing distributed across states in 2017. Here we see also a gap between East Germany and West Germany, but not as pronounced probably as for rental income, but still, interestingly, you see that the lower ownership rate that is often put into international context being very low for Germany is partly explained by the lower ownership rate in East German states. So in the 90s, about 25%, before unification, about 25% of households in Eastern Germany owned a house. So if we now see that this has increased to 30 or 40% in many Eastern German states, there has been some catch up in housing ownership in East German states, but still it has not reached West German levels, as more than 50% of households own real estates in Schleswig-Holstein, Lower Saxony, or Rhineland-Pfalz, or Baden-Württemberg, or Bavaria. How has this ownership rates evolved if we again differentiate between households in urban areas or more rural areas? And here we see that there is a slight increase, if you want, in consolidated or rural areas in housing ownership, but not a significant increase. And also interesting to point out that in rural areas, more than 60% of households actually own a house. In urban areas, this share has been lower, at about 40% in the 2000s, and this has increased over the past 15 years to almost 50%. So the largest increase in housing ownership is observed for urban areas. How does this increased ownership in urban areas translate into increased, or how is that connected to increased net housing wealth? So if we look at what these households actually have as housing wealth, we see that, interestingly, so these are numbers in real terms, so adjusted for rising prices. So we see that in all areas between 2002 and 2012, there has been actually a decline in housing wealth. And this is because during this period, consumer prices increased faster than housing prices. So if I wouldn't have adjusted it for prices, then we would have seen an increase, but we would, of course, we are always interested in what is this, what kind of purchasing power comes with the housing wealth. So this is why I adjust for prices in this context. And we see that there's been a marked increase between 2012 and 2017 across regions of net housing wealth, but the most substantial increase has happened in urban areas. So confirming what has been highlighted in the public debate, that urban areas have seen a higher increase in housing prices and housing wealth than more rural areas. Finally, we do again our exercise to decompose overall wealth inequality into the contribution of the different factors. So now I show you a variety of factors of asset types that contribute to wealth and thereby to wealth inequality. So we look at the wealth invested in the primary residence, in other real estate, in financial assets. This encompasses deposits, but also shares, stock-listed shares, business assets, and building loans and insurances. And I want to highlight two facts. First of all, business assets explain about half of overall wealth inequality in Germany, even though these assets are mostly or predominantly owned by the top 10% or the top 1%. So the top 1% in Germany owns 2/3 of overall business assets. So this is, business assets in Germany are very concentrated, and the top are very high, their aggregate. So the wealth that is concentrated at the top in aggregate is very high. So this explains a lot of what we see in overall wealth inequality in Germany. So business assets mostly belonging to the top 1% explain half of wealth inequality in Germany. And the other, almost the other half, is explained by inequality in the primary residence and other real estate. And here we see a slight reshuffling, that primary residence now explains more of inequality than other real estates did before. So probably the increased variation in house prices of the primary residences now contribute to explain a higher share of wealth inequality in Germany. But what I want to highlight again, if we measure wealth inequality in Germany by these traditional inequality measures like the Gini coefficient or the coefficient of variation in this context, we mostly focus on the upper half of the distribution because they own wealth. And the lower half of the distribution, please remember again that their share collapsed to 3% of the overall wealth is virtually not included in these measures by construction. So this is also something that I want to highlight. If we talk about wealth inequality, we're talking about the inequality among those who own wealth, and the lower half does not own substantial amounts of wealth. So they are not addressed in these exercises. Concluding now, housing ownership, housing wealth, and rental income still reveal persistent differences between East and West Germany, even though we've seen some catch-up growth. The share of housing ownership increased particularly in urban areas, and also average housing wealth increased in urban areas in real terms, whereas this remained rather stable in rural areas. This increased housing ownership, so houses of all types, both owner-occupied and non-owner-occupied, masks a rising share of landlords' households who receive rental income. So these households are mostly at the top of the income distribution, and now an increasing share of households at the top of the distribution additionally on their income from other sources like labor income or dividends also receive rental income. And to give you a magnitude, what I forgot a couple of slides before, mean average disposable income in Germany is about 28,000 euros per year, and the average rental income is between 8,000 and 12,000 euros per year. So just to give you a magnitude on what these households who now receive rental income get on top of what they probably earn as income from other sources, which is most likely much higher than the 28,000 average income in Germany. So rental income increasingly contributes to income inequality in Germany. And this is what I wanted to give you as input for the discussion to come.
Thank you very much. Thanks also for bringing in all the other papers that you wrote. You had a fantastic paper coming out earlier this year, which you cited, which is highly recommended. Yes, and now we have two commentators. I would like to ask Lucas if he could start giving his comments, then Mr. Peichl, and then we go into this discussion. So, hello, Lucas, are you there?
Thank you very much for giving the opportunity to.
You can turn your camera on, but up to you. Is there any sound?
Let me try. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me correctly? Can you hear me well?
Yeah, one paper that wasn't in there that you didn't cite was the famous economic history journal paper. And I also heard that Charlotte has a new paper coming out. I'm not gonna advertise other events here, but I just talked to Charlotte before this panel, which was also highly interesting. So this is highly relevant research. I'm very glad that there's a lot being done here.
Hello?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Hello. And first, thanks a lot for Charlotte and Carsten Schröder for this really fascinating work, and more generally also for the work that Charlotte and her colleagues are doing on wealth inequality in Germany. That is extremely important to make us international scholars of inequality be able to have more comparable estimates. And to be able to understand more in a comparative way what is happening across countries. And I just wanted to, very few and short comments on this paper, starting with this international perspective. So this paper, also citing the one that you just mentioned before on wealth inequality in Germany in the long run, starts by showing that the top 10% wealth share in Germany is about 55-56% of total wealth. Just to replace this in the international context, Germany is well in this kind of European wealth distribution typology of countries where you have a patrimonial middle class that has not was created in the 20th century, so creation of the 20th century, that has not been totally wiped out yet, as compared to a country like the US, where the top 10% owns 75% of all wealth. Similar levels that you can find in Russia, or extreme inequality countries like emerging countries such as South Africa, where the top 10% owns 90% of all wealth. So Germany is quite comparable to France or the UK, where the top 10 is owning around half of all the wealth that there is to own in the country. One factor here, I think, that the paper discusses to try to better understand why we see an increase in wealth inequality among European nations, but not as much as in the US. And this is the paradoxical effect of house price booms that support the patrimonial middle class, in the sense that the middle class, the middle 40%, own a lot of real estate, and so there is a kind of a non-secession effect that is associated to these real estate price booms. Non-secession between the middle 40% and the top 10%, but as Charlotte really mentioned, there is close to zero wealth at the bottom. But I think this is important to understand, the differential dynamics between France, Germany, perhaps the UK on the one side, and the US on the other. Now, that being said, I think it's also interesting and important to try to compare and contrast countries like Germany and France, and Germany, France, and the UK. And I think that, what the numbers put forward by Charlotte also show is that there's a slightly higher wealth inequality level in Germany than in France, at least when you look at top 10% figures. So just to try to compare again the numbers that we have, the top 10% in Germany owns about 2 million euros on average. That's 2 times higher than in France, where the top 10 owns 1 million euros on average. The middle 40% in Germany owns 400,000 euros on average. That's again 2 times the value that you find in France, 200,000 euros on average for the French patrimonial middle class. But now the bottom 50% seems extremely low in both countries, but even lower in Germany. That is, in Germany, you have a bottom 50% that owns about 20,000 euros. In France, it's a bit more, 25,000 euros. But you see that the gap between the bottom and the middle is much larger in Germany than in France. And if you look at the dynamics as well, as Charlotte was mentioning, there's no growth at the bottom of the wealth distribution over 20 years. There is some growth in a country like France. So I think it's also important and interesting to try to understand what happened there. Indeed, income inequality and the dynamics of income inequality really matter. So what we see also in Charlotte's and Carsten's paper is really a very striking stagnation of post-tax or after government, as it's called in the paper, income. The very poor of the poor at the bottom of the distribution are poorer today than in 2002. The median post-tax income is about the same today as in 2002. This is a difference, a divergence between a country like Germany and France. Potential reason factor 2 that I think deserves some further discussion here when we're trying to compare and contrast European countries with one another is the strong role of business assets at the top 1% in Germany. It seems to me that we have a bit less business assets in a country like France at the top. Reason 3, regional divides. And I think the paper makes a clear case here by showing that there is a very little catch up between East and West, and still an extremely important gap between the wealth of both regions. So this leads me to my final point, which are two questions. One more on the methodology, which is, do we have enough material to assess regional ownership of the West, of the East by the West? So here we had, shares of owners in each region. Do we know who owns what where? That's my first point. And what have been the dynamics of this ownership or regional ownership? Second point, more about policy. So what should be done considering the fact that the bottom 50%, they don't have much, they have close to nothing. This has been stagnating over the past 20 years. Is it more public housing? Is it more Mietpreisbremse, more controlled rental prices? Is it more taxation to finance more construction in the housing sector? How do we do a housing policy that works for the bottom 50% that do not own housing yet, without alienating the middle 40% of owners? So this is a few questions that I'd also be interested to hear from you, Charlotte. But thanks again for this fascinating paper and this fascinating work.
Thank you very much. Yes, applaud. Thank you very much. I really like this. Fantastic questions. I would prefer to go directly to Andreas Peichl and have all comments, and then move on to discussion. I think I noted the questions for later. Unless you prefer to answer something now, Charlotte, it's up to you. I wrote down international comparison, if we have enough tools to assess who owns what in East and West, and which policies works, but not alienating the middle class. So those are the three questions I comment. So I think we note that, come back to this later, and we first go to the second comment. Mr. Peichl, are you here with us?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you and see you.
Great. I've prepared some slides, so let's try if I can share those. Does this work? No, I'm not.
Yes. Yes, this looks good.
Okay, great. So thanks for having me, and thanks for organizing this conference. I think it's a great event. Also, the timing is a bit unfortunate, as the Vereinstagung, the German Economic Association, is in parallel, and I have to be on a panel later today, so I'll miss parts of the interesting stuff here. But I hope you put it online, and so I can see it later. And thanks also Charlotte and Carsten for this very interesting paper, and this important study on the drivers of inequality, and especially the focus on the real estate market, which I think is it's really an important topic, and we have a lot of discussions in this. I will have three comments. In general, a bit more general on the composition, the role of household formation, a bit on data, and also, let's say, for the discussion then on the implications, what follows from this study for redistribution. But before that, I have two more minor things on the study itself. So the first thing is, I was wondering what the role of the choice of the base and the end year. So you choose 2002 and 2017, and especially for this decomposition of the wealth assets later, where you showed that business assets play a key role and that this increase. I was wondering which role 2002 plays when basically we were in a recession after 9/11 and so on the year before. And the stock market was relatively low, whereas in 2017 it was relatively high. So whether this plays a role for these type of decompositions, that's something I would see maybe in a follow-up or in a new version to play a bit around with these base and end years. And another just a question, that something which I just wrote right now, because when you said something that the real wealth increase between 2017 and 2012, so I think that was slide 14 or so of your presentation, was larger in rural versus urban areas. And from my reading from the graph was that it was in absolute terms about the same, or the other way around. Maybe you can comment on this or clarify this. So if it was the case that the increase in urban areas was almost as large, or even in relative terms larger, then this would be indeed surprising. So maybe I misunderstood the graph there. But on more general, on the comments on the topic, the first thing, I think that's interesting in general, is that if we look at the long run, we see a decline in the average household size. So we have more singles, less children, also mobility. So children leaving the houses earlier, and this leads to an increase in the number of households. And if we look then at inequality on the household level, so we have more households, more units, and if this can lead, or this has been shown that this leads to an increase in income inequality. And I think that this is also relevant in this context, since typically rental income, housing wealth, and also expenditures are measured on the household level. And of course, if you now have, and there are economies of scales involved in, for example, renting. And so this clearly has then also an effect here. And I would like to see at least a discussion of that, or maybe that's something we can discuss here. And in general, if we have these changes in composition, this has obviously implications on the on cross-sectional approaches like this one. Remember, this is not like really a panel study following the individuals over time, but it's looking at the cross-sectional distribution in 2002, and then again the cross-sectional distribution in 2017, or some years in between, and you look at who is at the bottom and at the top in these different distributions. But if the size of the population or the household, the number of households is changing, then obviously this can have effects, and you can construct some weird examples that individuals' incomes all go up, but the average incomes of all deciles go down if the population size is increasing. So I think it would also be, it's something we should maybe talk about in the discussion, and also maybe for a revised version of the paper that could be interesting. The second point in general I want to make, because I think this here is not only an academic audience, so that at least my understanding was that there's maybe also some people in Berlin from ministries or policymakers. We in general see that a lot of inequality analysis, a lot of it depends on the data. And while I do not want to criticize the sub-data here in general, it's the best data we have for this data. What I would like to say to the policymakers in the room, or the bureaucrats, we have a real issue in Germany in terms of data availability, especially for research. And this, despite the fact that we collect a lot of administrative data. So we have in principle data on rental and capital income, on property wealth, and so on from the various taxes. So we have the income taxes, the capital income taxes, property taxes, and so on. And this data is available, and there's a unique tax ID, and this data could be linked. And this could be even in line with the GDPR, it can be linked and could be made available for research. And then we would know much more about these distributions and the developments, because obviously the survey data is great, and the SUP is one of the best, if not the best, household survey in the world, but it's limited to 10,000 households or so. And this is obviously, as soon as if you want to dig into very much details at the reach below Bundesland level, it's hardly possible to do anything, and that's obviously an big issue here. So for these type of also regional analysis. So it would be important that we improve this data situation. And there are some recent initiatives, for example, from the Wissenschaftliche Beirat, the Scientific Advisory Council of the Federal Ministry of Finance. And I think that's something what we've also seen in the current crisis, that we in many cases we don't have the data or the tools to make evidence-based decision in real time, and that's a real problem in general. So that's independent of this study, but especially for studying inequality, it would be nice and important to have access to good administrative data. And France, for example, is doing much more in this direction and making much more data available recently, and that's something where we should follow. The last point I want to make, which is now coming to the policy discussion, we've seen that there is an increase in inequality in general over time. We can obviously discuss a few of the details, but the question now is what should we do as a government? And what I think, the point that I want to make is that an increase in inequality does not necessarily require an additional policy intervention. It really depends on the sources of these inequalities. And I would bring into the discussion another argument, which is a bit more about fairness. So is this increase fair or unfair? And related to this, if we look into the philosophical literature on distributive justice, most philosophers would agree that from equality or inequality, it does not necessarily follow that something is unfair or unjust. So it's really, it depends a bit on your fairness preferences. And there was 2 years ago in the idea is summarized nicely in this picture here. Where on the left-hand side, you have equality in outcomes. Here, the outcomes is this having a grade. So this could also be seen in income, but in the end, so this is everybody has the same income in that sense. But in the end, in terms of welfare, one of the 3 persons is not able to see the football match here. But then there's equity, which is redistributing this, let's say, income in a way that everybody has the same welfare by watching the football match. Whereas on the right-hand side, real justice is achieved when you tackle the sources of not being able to watch the football match, and that's sort of the idea summarized in this comic, that equality, equity, and also justice can mean different things. And in the SUB 2 years ago, there were questions about this. And for example, there was a question whether people agree to the statement that a society is just if income and wealth are equally distributed among its members. And the support for this was less than 50% in the German population. And this is also true for, if you look at the European Social Survey, and for many European or all European countries that are in the survey. And it's also if you run experimental studies in the lab or in doing this. So if you look at these studies, there are 2 concepts typically, and also in the SUB analysis where you find support, and these are the principles of equality of opportunity and freedom from poverty. So the idea of the latter is freedom from poverty, that everybody should have enough to make ends meet. And that's, I think, something, especially in the context of, if we talk about wealth in Germany, we see that wealth at the bottom of the distribution is very low, and we seriously need to think how to improve wealth accumulation of people at the bottom of the distribution. That's, I think, for sure. And the other thing is the idea of equality of opportunity, that is basically depending on your background, your circumstances, and whether you can make it to the top, basically whether everybody has equal chances. And we see that we have several problems there in Germany in terms of the education system, but also in terms of, for example, if we think about the inheritance taxation in Germany, which is basically you can, as soon as you have enough wealth, you can avoid paying any inheritance tax, and that doesn't make any sense. So I think we have some serious problems there. But what I would like to see is also in the discussion to take these more philosophical principles into account. But then obviously the key issue here is that we need to make explicit normative statements, and that's something we as economists often, and especially if we're empirical economists, often try to avoid, because we need to really say what we think, what is fair and what is unfair. Generally, that's something very individual. So everybody has a personal view. And let me end by this nice quote from René Descartes of this thing, of all things, good sense is the most fairly distributed. Everyone thinks that he is so well supplied with it and never desires more of it than they already have. So that's, I think, the only thing where we agree that this is fairly distributed. But for all the other things, we can discuss this. And I'm now looking forward to the discussion on this topic and the paper and in general. So thanks again for the presentation and for having me here.
Thank you very much, Andreas Peichl, for those excellent comments. I think we have a lot to discuss. I could imagine a football pitch with no fences at all, so maybe where we can all combine inequality, and injustice, but maybe put this philosophical question more to the end, maybe come back to Lucas' comments about the national context versus the international context. What can we learn from examples like France, where the differences and so forth, and the other questions: do we have enough tools to assess who owns what, etc., and what policy? Maybe the policy question we can also put to the end. Maybe those two first. Charlotte, would you like to respond to the comments?
Yes. Maybe I can first of all, thank you, Luca and Andreas, for really great comments, very much in depth and broad at the same time. Maybe I can come back to a point that both raised, in fact. So as I'm a researcher, very much resonates with me, their points raised about the data sources. So maybe I can highlight 3 factors that being Andreas criticized that I chose 2002, 2007, 12, 17. So this is in fact a data limitation. The ZEP only dares to survey wealth every 5 years because you see that the respondents drop out after being surveyed for their wealth. So we only do it every 5 years. And unfortunately, this is predetermined the years that I can analyze. I strongly support your call, Andreas, for administrative data. I fully agree that we would need much more data that are in fact produced for administrative reasons, but not available for researchers. But particularly for rental income, I feel that the SEP is a very good data source because rental income and tax data is very famous to use as a loophole to do it like Trump in the 90s to reduce, to take losses from renting and leasing to reduce overall income tax burden. So in fact, in the income tax data, we see negative income from renting and leasing. So I guess with respect to investigating rental income, the SEP data actually might give us a better picture because the income tax data show very low rental incomes at the bottom. And then also those families who have a lot of real estate probably have their real estate in the form of businesses, which we cannot differentiate in income tax data. So we wouldn't be able to identify their large incomes from large possessions of housing and particularly in urban areas with the income tax data, unfortunately. And this maybe adds another dimension that also Luca, let me add another dimension that also Luca asked for. So unfortunately, we can, both in income tax data and in SEP data, only analyze the location of the household who receives rental income. So unfortunately, we don't know where the rental income comes from. So we cannot investigate. I have no idea. So I'm happy if anybody has an idea how I could relate differences in rents across region to the households that receive these rental incomes. So
I think this greatly goes over to one point that Andreas Peichl also mentioned. this whole urban versus rural story, you can't really measure, or it's hard to measure where the income goes, who owns what. So
no, I know where the income goes to. I know where the household lives. I know what the household owns, who lives in a certain district, but I don't know where this comes from.
Right. Yes, and then Andreas Peichl was also asking about the household size decreasing.
I can also say something about that. Andreas, we're preparing a new version of the paper with Thilo and Moritz, and I've produced a very nice graph where we do this famous Dinari Fortin-Lemieux reweighting exercise to control for changes in household composition, and we only find very minor effects on the different wealth growth rates across the distribution. So it's not that the increasing share of single households is behind the collapse of the bottom 50% wealth share. I can say that. Oh.
Maybe I can also ask something about, because Andreas Peichl said that we need to improve the data situation. You already touched on this. I always thought it was because we got rid of the wealth tax that we don't have this administrative data anymore, that like after, when was it, in 98 or 95, we got rid of the wealth tax, and so it's very hard to collect that data from tax returns. Is that something I'm wrong about, or something?
Of course, there's a lot of administrative data that is being produced, wealth tax data being one of them, being not produced anymore. But then what is Andreas mostly concerned with is that these data sources that still do exist are not, we're not allowed to link them. So in other countries, you can link, for example, the Abgeltungssteuer with the tax declaration with the survey data, so that we can combine the different informations that we have on the households across data sources. But this is not allowed in Germany. If I use the income tax data, I can use the income tax data and nothing else. So I cannot use that to, for example, link that with corporate tax data to understand to what extent part of the corporate tax is declared.
Right. Okay.
And can I say something?
Maybe I can bring in our other two panelists. We have some questions in the chat also. One which I found very interesting, and I was also pondering about myself, is like, so there are different forms of inequality: income inequality, wealth inequality. So, and it seems there are different dynamics. You said, you rightly pointed out now, maybe capital income is the more important, or there's a mechanical relationship going on. Capital income becomes more important than labor income or whatever, and then rental income now is becoming more important. So there's a lot of dynamics in the chat. One person has asked how many individuals and households move between deciles within the wealth distribution. And then we also have this urban-rural dynamic. So how can we measure inequality if there are like so many different dynamics? Can we really see what's going on? Also about our measurements, like the Gini coefficients, do they really capture everything? Maybe I can bring in Lucas about the dynamics of inequality, and then we go back to Andreas Peichl. Hello.
I'm not 100% sure that the connection went on well. If you could repeat just the question.
So we have a question in the chat. How about the dynamic aspect of inequality? How many individuals, households move between deciles of the wealth income distribution? Certainly there must have been movements between income groups in the period covered. And yeah.
So precisely for the case of Germany, I actually would be really interested to know better about this. In the case of countries where we have relatively good information to assess these questions, in particular in the US, what we know is that, despite what is said about, the possibility for movement, a lot of movement up to the top, we know that there is actually a very little movement among, the top 1%, the top 5% of the distribution. of income and less of wealth. So this is a absolutely an important part of the question. In general, when you have high or rise in inequality as measured by the types of metrics and data that Charlotte has been presenting here, that we could call anonymous inequality data, in the sense that we don't really know who are in these groups. This in general also tends to represent a rise in inequality, or more precisely, very little movement between one group and the next. At least this is what we observe in a country like the USA, for instance.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I can also bring my part of the question back in about the dynamics to Andreas Peichl. So if we are talking about the drivers of inequality, and it's a very dynamic process, is it labor income that matters? So differences, say, there's like technological progress, and you have difference in wages, you have those superstar firms, or is it a political question? If it's political decisions such as taxes and so forth, and yeah, how can we look at the dynamics of those drivers?
Yeah, it's a tough question in the sense that it's very complicated issue, or complicated dynamics behind it. I have to be a bit careful, because we have written a report for the next Armuts- und Reichtumsbericht, so the government a report on income and wealth, which should have been published, but thanks to Corona, it's not yet published, and so I'm not allowed to talk about this. So I need to be a bit careful there. We've looked at dynamics of income and wealth and so on, and this is hopefully coming soon. In general, what we've seen obviously is, I think Charlotte also has showed this a bit, what we know from the data is that we've seen income inequality, wage inequality, especially at the end of the 90s, in the early 2000s. Labor income inequality was important for a lot of dynamics, but at least since the mid-2000s, the business income side became more important, also with the stock market development. And if you look at these indicators, and this is clearly having an effect both on the income distribution and the wealth distribution. And I think in general, if we look at in Germany, Germany has one of the, in international comparison, Germany has one of the lowest home ownership rates and one of the lowest also share of people investing in the stock market. So in that sense, owning business assets and also ownerships in general, direct ownership of firms is not so high. So we rely a lot on labor income for the vast majority of the population. And this is, as other work by Moritz Schulerik has shown, that especially on the real estate and on the stock market is where in the long run you make the high returns. And so if you're not invested in these high return assets, you cannot participate. And that's, I think, what also explains partly the relatively large wealth inequality in Germany, together with the fact that a lot of people don't like taking on debt to buy a house, and maybe despite all the recent problems, the rental market is or at least was working relatively well in international comparison. So I think it's, in that sense, it's relatively complex, the whole area, but also looking at the dynamics and doing really a panel analysis would be very interesting to see what's behind these different developments by Cree.
So you are proposing sort of more the American model, or like I think Branko Milanovic proposed once a stock buying program for the bottom 50% or something in that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there are different options. There is something what was called a Bürgerfond and other things, or participation, where you things like in Sweden, where part of the pension system is mandated by the government or organized by the government, put into stock markets. And I mean, right now, I mean, Corona is changing a lot of things, but before the situation, we could have borrowed as Germany money and would have paid for it actually, and could have invested this internationally on the stock market, for example, and redistribute this somehow to the bottom. These type of things. I think in general, but also in terms of home ownership, it's relatively hard, and also the extra costs to buy a house, like you have the property transaction tax, you have the fees that you have to pay, and so on. This can, in Berlin, I think it can amount up to 14 or 15% of the house price, and that's obviously something which hinders a lot of also transactions, and also people ability, especially in the middle of the distribution, to invest into the housing market. And that's, Germany is one of the few countries in Europe where we have the home ownership rate is below 50%, and that's, I think it's not, it's no surprise.
Okay, we have a question in our virtual audience from Richard Zenner, which I want to bring in. It's directed to all. So feel free to, whoever wants to answer this. Otherwise, I'm gonna pick somebody of you. How is the German mercantilist current account surplus linked to wealth and inequality? How does access to mortgages by income group compare to other countries? Do poor households have access to bank credit joining the housing party? So I think the last two questions sort of touch upon what Andreas Peichl just said. The first one about Germany's current account surplus, I would reference the study that we will have later today by Achim Truger and co-authors on the German current account. We have been also doing webinars and stuff on that. So that's going to be exciting. I'm not sure how you're all with international economics, but if somebody, I mean, Germany is really the export Weltmeister. We already, was for a number of years. And Charlotte, you showed a business asset matter a lot. So is it really those small, medium-sized enterprise maybe that also could be a driver in this inequality, and it has to do with exports?
Yes, in my long-run paper on top incomes in Germany, I can see a clear positive correlation between the export share in total GDP and top incomes. So this suggests that most of the benefits from the export Weltmeister actually accrue to the top 10%, the top 1% of the income distribution, because those are the owners of the businesses, the medium-sized and large German Mittelstand, which is actually not so small, but very large. And those top income earners,
underrated word.
those top income earners in Germany are 80% of their income comes from unincorporated family firms, and less than 15% comes from dividends from stock markets. So just to give you a perspective on this small Mittelstand.
Fantastic. We have only 5 minutes more because we need some technical setups for the next panel. So I would like to come back to this last question by Andreas Peichl, this philosophical question. What is fairness? And maybe I could bring Luca back in here. What is fairness, and how can we cope with this difference between inequality, inequity, and injustice? If we to find a road.
And when we study equality, inequality, we may all have in mind, what would be a good income distribution or wealth distribution. As researchers or as citizens, I don't think anyone has the good or the true answer. There's no model that should be there to tell us what this level should be. This should be a matter of collective deliberation. This is a political choice. But that being said, I think that between the very high inequality levels that we observe, whether in the US where it's extreme, but also in Europe where it's higher than it was 20 years ago, and extreme equality where, the bottom 50% would have 50% of all wealth, and the top 50% would have 50% of all wealth. You know, there's a wide variety of possibilities. And I think, you know, when we look at the numbers for the bottom 50%, there's quite a margin before, you know, before thinking that that would be too much equality if this level was increased. Now, the real question that we have is, can we increase the wealth at the bottom without doing anything at the top? You know, perhaps it's possible, but that's really an open question. But perhaps also it's not possible to invest in, you know, housing, invest in the bottom 50% without taxing a bit more the top 10 or the top 1%, where wealth is really highly concentrated. And we also know that, you know, money doesn't just fall from the sky. So if you really want to invest in the bottom 50%, how do we do in a context of rising and relatively large inequality levels?
I think we have one more comment from we can go back to Andreas Peichl, and then if you would like to respond to that.
So I think in terms of, let's say, wealth inequality, indeed, we need to think about how to increase the wealth at the bottom. And then it's indeed true, we need to also think in general about what is the right level of taxation that we want to put on the different parts of the income distribution. And I personally think we don't need a wealth tax or a new wealth tax for this if we were to seriously tax all income sources in the right way and inheritances. But in Germany, we basically, if you have a certain income, exceed a certain income, you don't pay inheritance tax if you have a good tax lawyer, and that's something which I personally find very unfair. And there are also lots of possibilities to avoid paying income taxes on certain forms of capital income. Charlotte mentioned this earlier, that if you put the right deductions, you get negative income from renting out. And I mean, that's something which is clearly something that should be discussed. And also in terms of capital income and the way capital gains are treated or were treated and so on, that's something, especially if you hold assets for a certain period, or if you put them in certain construct, in certain type of legal forms, you can sell it without paying taxes and so on. And that's something which I think we should tackle. We should close all these loopholes. And then this would already generate a lot more tax revenue, and especially it would also hit those who are using these loopholes, which are typically not the bottom 90%, but the top of the distribution.
Thanks. So Charlotte, to close this, maybe you can also, if you want, to address this philosophical question again, what is fairness? Or you could also go into what are the best tools for also the German context, what Andreas Peichl and Luca just talked about, and then maybe I can again highlight that we will have a third stage of the project where we exactly gonna try to answer this: what tools are most efficient to, for example, increase the bottom wealth of the 50%.
So maybe I can try to connect the point of fairness that Andreas raised with what I said in the beginning of my talk about labor income and capital income. So I guess something that most of the people can agree on is that if you exert a lot of effort, you should also receive a high income. So if you work a lot, then you should receive high income. And the fact that macroeconomically capital income has increased in importance, and that capital income comes with not so much work as labor income, is something that we probably could all agree on. And that is why we should better understand why capital income is increasing and who is receiving this capital income. And also, as Andreas mentioned just now, how we can better tax these capital incomes yeah, as we probably can all agree on that, capital incomes are less fair than labor incomes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for your amazing work in this project. Thank you to all the panelists. Yeah. Your part. Thank you very much.